Alright, now we're on to my favorite topic. This is another gem by Freud. He believed that all actions occur as a result of an unconscious psychic struggle between what we want to do and what we know we should probably do. Now let's use Freud's favorite example. Do you want to have sex with your mother? Of course not, says you. That's horrible and disgusting. Yeah, but what if she's really, really hot? How could I even think of doing such a thing, you protest? And I'd venture to guess that this isn't something you've actually thought about. Don't want to know if it is. Now, Freud would argue that the reason that you don't, and in fact can't think of your hot mom in that way, is because if you had the slightest inkling that that debate was going on in your head, you'd realize what a sick, sick pervert you really are. Enter ego defenses. They're here to protect you from realizing that some of the things that go on in your head are totally not okay. As it turns out, the brain's developed some pretty creative ways of blocking out some of your more unacceptable id impulses. There's a whole list of ego defenses in first aid, and weirdly enough, these are actually reasonably high yield. I briefly debated putting you through the torture of having me recite all 18 of these, but that's not how we do things here at First Aid Express. We'll keep this streamlined. A lot of the ego defenses are actually pretty intuitive. We use a lot of these colloquially in ways that are pretty much identical to their official psychodynamic definitions. Dissociation is kind of the odd man out here, but if you understand the dissociative disorders, this is pretty much the same thing going on a more minor temporary scale. We'll talk about those in the psych pathology section. Now, I'm not going to spend any more time on these ones. You can read all of them on your own. There are a few less intuitive defense mechanisms that you may not be able to define just by reading the name. Isolation sounds like locking yourself in your room to escape reality, but really, it's isolation of affect. And every time you read the name of this, by the way, I want you to add of affect silently in your head, just to train yourself to remember it. Isolation is when people keep a flat affect, even when talking about a horrible emotional trauma, in an attempt to block out their own emotions. Identification is the process of modeling your identity on someone more powerful than you. It doesn't involve identifying anything, it's about one's identity. Keep in mind, while this might sound like hero worship, this actually happens most often in abusive households. Finally, splitting, which is probably the highest yield of the three, involves dividing or splitting up the world into absolutes. Now this often means perceiving people or demographics as absolutely good or absolutely bad. Now, I really want you to recognize this when it pops up in your vignettes, because it's a characteristic defense mechanism in borderline personality disorder. Check out the psych pathology section for a more detailed description of BPD. While I want you to spend some time memorizing these definitions on your own, I'm going to walk you through several distinctions between the remaining defense mechanisms that appear similar on the surface so you don't get them mixed up on the real test. Because the main way you'll be tested on these is by simple identifications in a vignette, nothing multi-step. As you can see though, it's easy to confuse a number of these. The defense trio of repression, suppression, and denial are pretty frequently mixed up because they're all pretty similar. They're the most basic defense mechanisms because they don't involve any fancy distraction techniques to get rid of unwanted feelings or thoughts. They basically all work on the principle, if it hurts to think about, just don't think about it. The difference between them is where in the progression from unconscious to conscious thought the defense mechanism occurs. Let's take a really common example for all three. Receiving the diagnosis of a serious illness like cancer or HIV. The patient can consciously hear the words, but after the conversation takes place, the reality of the diagnosis can be buried in the subconscious. If the patient's so traumatized by the diagnosis that they subconsciously block out the memory, that's called repression. And this may sound extreme, but it's actually pretty common, especially in other scenarios like childhood or sexual abuse. Suppression is where the patient is aware of what's going on, but consciously chooses not to think about it, because doing so would hurt them enough to impair them in the moment. One example is if they have something they really need to focus on right now. This is considered the most mature defense mechanism of all three. Denial's interesting because it involves a conscious awareness of the news, but a subconscious inability to accept the news, even when all evidence points to it being true. It's easy to confuse with either repression or suppression, but remember that unlike repression, they at least know that somebody believes that they're sick or they have an unacceptable impulse or what have you, but they just can't accept it for themselves. Projection and displacement are actually very different defense mechanisms, and the only reason they get mixed up a lot is that both of them involve making your problem someone else's problem. As it turns out, it's actually easier to remember the differences than you might think. For projection, just think of one of those old school projectors, the ones that shine light through the transparencies. Basically, The patient with the unacceptable tendency, say a patient who's a huge jerk to people all the time, protects his own ego from feeling bad about the fact that he's a jerk by seeing his own jerkiness in other people. It's like he's the transparency for the projector, and the unacceptable tendency is literally being projected through him onto somebody else. So for example, the patient may come in complaining about how his coworkers are always so rude on Mondays, but that could just be because he's projecting his own Monday crankiness onto his coworkers. Displacement's a little bit simpler. With displacement, you take your unacceptable urges towards one person, say Pete the no-good PA student, and act them out towards another person. No, not Michaela. Why would a person do that, you ask? It could be because even though you want to yell at Pete, he's big and mean looking. But you don't want your ego to think you're a coward. So you yell at Michaela if she so much as looks at you the wrong way. And while your brain's trying to convince you that Michaela was the one who was out of line, you really just lashed out at her because she's a lot less intimidating than Pete. Man, that poor Michaela. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Regression and fixation are defense mechanisms that can be simplified into a common principle. Things were easier during childhood. If a certain part of your development was abnormal as a kid, that part of your personal growth could be stunted, and you might get fixated on certain specific childish behaviors as a form of gratification or escapism. I wouldn't Google this one. This is one of Freud's real winners where he gets really abstract about oral and anal this and that, and it all gets pretty weird from there. Just stick with my explanation. It's higher yield, and you won't be traumatized by it. While you can think of fixation as never growing up, regression involves actively turning back the developmental clock in response to stress. Now in your vignettes, you'll tend to see fixation in adults who've been doing something childish for a while, like playing video games or something like that. But it's more common to see regression in kids who are actively developing and get stressed out by something. Kids might start to wet the bed, suck their thumb in response to a move, or someone being mean to them in school. For me, remembering regression is pretty easy. It sounds pretty much like what it is. Fixation was always a challenge, though. I could never remember that it related to childhood. My mnemonic was to think of one of the most beloved childhood Mr. Fix-Its of our time, Bob the Builder, to help me remember that fixation occurs during childhood. Our final comparison is between reaction formation and sublimation, which get confused because both of them involve transforming an unacceptable impulse into a more acceptable action. Take anger issues, for example. The most direct response to feeling angry is to immediately punch someone in the face, or yell at them, or cry, or any other host of socially unacceptable behaviors. Reaction formation is the process of unconsciously redirecting that anger towards the opposite emotion, leading to a more acceptable action, but one that's totally the opposite. Doesn't sound like it makes sense, but I guess it's just the subconscious mind trying to convince you that you're a good person. Now this can be useful, don't get me wrong, but it's ultimately unfulfilling because the person's essentially going against their own nature. The more mature and self-aware option is sublimation, where the person's aware of the problem and consciously redirects the impulse towards a similar behavior. One really common way of sublimating anger is to go do something physical, and a lot of people put their aggression and stress into working out or playing contact sports. If you keep mixing these up, remember that they both have pretty good physics-related mnemonics to help you remember them. Reaction formation can be remembered as Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, so the behavior is the opposite of the impulse. Sublimation, on the other hand, you remember what that is, by the way? The phase change from solid to gas? Well, anyway, sublimation involves a conversion of state, but at the end of the day, they're the same molecules, just like psychological sublimation involves the same impulse, just directed differently. Now that's it for defense mechanisms, and I hope you learned something today. Let's see if I actually helped you remember this stuff with a flash quiz. Now your job is to identify the defense mechanism. Mina comes into the doctor's office after her fourth tumultuous breakup of the year and states that all of her previous boyfriends were horrible. She's now seen another man who she identifies as the most wonderful person alive and is certain that he is the one. Go ahead and pause the video if you need some time to identify. The answer is splitting, perceiving the world in terms of extremes. In Mina's case, it's possible that this is a defense mechanism against the idea that she may be the one responsible for her relationships going sour. This is a very commonly tested defense mechanism on step 1, as it's also the hallmark defense mechanism of a certain personality disorder. Remember which one? It's borderline personality disorder, a disorder that's characterized by unstable relationships, emotional lability, and impulsive and self-mutilatory behavior. Now that's all for psychology. Join me for some DSM-4 action with the pathology section coming up next. And as always, if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up down below. Arjun Iyer, signing out.